Next, we'll go to the composition named number 2, Flower Fall. This is simply a blank canvas for us to paint on with only a light gray solid in our composition. We know that we can paint on it by using the brush tool or using Control B, Command B on the Mac. Now, if you're already on the brush tool and use Control B or Command B again, it'll take you to the Clone tool. Using Control B or Command B on the Mac will take you next to the Eraser tool. Finally, using Control B or Command B on the Mac again will bring you back to the brush tool. It's important to note which tool you're on in the tool palette before you start working in your layer window. We'll stick with the brush tool, then move over to our composition, then double-click to get into the layer window. We'll change the brush tip by navigating over to the Options or the Brush Tips panel, then clicking on the Hard Brush number 13. I'll navigate back to the Paint options, then change the duration from Custom to Constant. I also want to change the position of the playhead in my timeline. If I move the playhead in the timeline to 1 second and draw a brush stroke, then open the paint parameters in the timeline by twirling down the layer, opening up Effects and Paint, or even easier by typing PP on the keyboard, I can see that the brush has been created at this point in time and continues constantly for the rest of the layer. However, I may want to have this start at the very beginning of the composition. I can do this 2 ways. The first way is to simply go to the first frame, then delete this brush by selecting the brush and using backspace or delete, then redrawing the brush shape. However, I can also do this a different way. By selecting the brush layer in the timeline, I can drag this around. Previously, we saw that we could trim the in point and the out point by dragging on the handles at the edge of the brush's layer. I can also move the entire layer by dragging on the layer itself. With the brush stroke still selected and the brush tool selected, if I draw another brush stroke, when I release the mouse, the brush stroke will be modified to my new brush stroke. That's because down in the timeline, brush 1 was selected. Again, I'll leave this brush stroke selected, then draw a new path with my mouse. To create new brush strokes rather than editing the brush stroke I'm currently on, I need to deselect this brush stroke by clicking anywhere in the timeline so that brush stroke is deselected, then simply choosing Paint. Now when I paint new brush strokes, they will show up in my timeline as new brushes. I'll delete brush 2 and brush 3 and focus on brush 1. In the parameters for brush 1, in addition to the stroke options and the transform options for this brush, there is a path option. By clicking on the stopwatch for path, I can set up an animation for this stroke by setting a keyframe at frame 0, then placing my playhead at 10 frames in my timeline, and drawing a new brush stroke. Because I have keyframes enabled with the stopwatch, and I've drawn a new brush stroke with brush 1 selected, After Effects will now interpolate between these 2 brush strokes and create an animation. I'll move down to frame 20, then with the brush layer still selected, draw a new brush stroke on the other side. I'm going to switch to the stylus, which will allow me to work a little bit faster, so you may see the cursor jump around a little bit on screen. The first thing I want to do is select brush 1, and I'll delete it. Using the backspace or the delete key, delete brush 1. And I also want to see the entire layer inside of my layer window. Again, I'll use the Alt key and / button, or Option and / on a Mac to adjust the layer window to this panel. Next, I want to create some red strokes, so I'll change the color to red. Finally, I'll create the brush strokes that I want. I'll draw the word I, then a little heart for I love, and then a third brush stroke for something that I love. Maybe I love goldfish. Instead of goldfish, you may change your mind and decide that you need to draw a different brush stroke. It's not me that loves goldfish. Maybe you love goldfish. By selecting the brush stroke in the layer, we can simply choose the brush stroke in the timeline, then paint in the layer window to modify that brush stroke. Now instead of you loving goldfish, maybe you love cats. So very simply, I can make the changes Rather than you loving cats, maybe I love octopus. So those changes are very easy to make once you understand by selecting the brush strokes in the timeline. We modify the paths that represent where the brush stroke is going to go. If you want to animate the different things that you love, we'll use brush 3, which represents the things we love, then set a stopwatch for the path. The very first thing we love is goldfish. So we'll draw a little goldfish and then move down 10 frames by holding the Shift key down and using page down to advance 10 frames. Change this from goldfish to a cat. Now we love cats. We'll use Shift and page down again to draw our little octopus. As we scrub in the timeline between these shapes, we'll see After Effects interpolate between the different paths that we've drawn. After Effects tries its best to interpolate it properly, but you may see some folding or overlapping of paths depending on how you've drawn your shape. To completely avoid this, we can select all of the keyframes, then use Ctrl-Alt-H or Command-Alt-H on a Mac to set those to hold keyframes. Now After Effects won't interpolate between the keyframes, but instead just draw a new image at each new keyframe.